In the shadowed halls of Styles Court, the venomous villa, a deadly poison claims the life of wealthy matriarch Emily Inglethorpe. As suspicion falls on her secretive husband and fractured family, Captain Arthur Hastings calls on the legendary Hercule Poirot to unravel a web of lies, hidden motives, and chilling clues. From locked rooms to fake beards, every step reveals a new twist in this sinister game of greed and betrayal. Will Poirot's little grey cells expose the killer before the venom strikes again? Dive into the mysterious affair at Styles' venomous villa where no one is what they seem. Chapter 1. Rival at the venomous Velarthy train rattled through the English countryside, its rhythmic clatter a steady companion to Captain Arthur Hastings as he gazed out the window. At the rolling fields of Essex, it was the summer of 1916, and the war had left its mark on him both in the faint limp he carried from a shrapnel wound, and in the weariness that clung to his thoughts like damp fog. The world felt heavier now, its edges sharper, and he welcomed the invitation from his old friend John Cavendish to spend time at Styles Court, a sprawling estate, nestled in the quiet village of Styles, St. Mary. The promise of rest, of familiar faces and warm hearths was a balm he sorely needed. Yet, as the train slowed and the platform came into view, a prickle of unease stirred in his chest, as though the very air whispered of secrets hidden beneath the idyllic surface. Hastings stepped onto the platform, his single suitcase in hand, and inhaled the crisp July air. The station was small, almost quaint, with a single bench and a faded sign that read Styles, St. Mary. A horse-drawn cart waited nearby, its driver a weary man with a weathered face who tipped his cap as Hastings approached. "Captain Hastings, sir, for Styles Court," the man asked, his voice rough but polite. "That's right," Hastings replied, offering a tired smile. "You're from the house, I take it." "Aye, sir." "Name's Tom. Mr. Cavendish sent me to fetch you." Tom hefted the suitcase into the cart with practiced ease, and soon they were trundling along a winding lane, the clip-clop of hooves mingling with the distant hum of bees. The countryside unfolded in gentle hills and hedgerows, but Hastings' thoughts were elsewhere, drifting to memories of John Cavendish, his schoolmate, his comrade in lighter days before the war had carved lines into their lives. Styles Court loomed into view as they crested a rise, its red brick facade both grand and imposing against the green expanse of its lawns. The house was Elizabethan in style, with tall chimneys and mullioned windows that glinted in the afternoon sun. Ivy clung to its walls, giving it an air of timelessness, but there was something else, a faint menace in the way the shadows fell across the stone, as though the villa itself held its breath. Hastings shook off the notion, chalking it up to his own fatigue. This was to be a place of respite, not foreboding. Tom guided the cart to the front entrance where John Cavendish waited, his broad shoulders and easy grin a welcome sight. "Arthur, old chap," John called, striding forward with a hand outstretched. "You're looking a bit worse for wear, but we'll soon fix that. Come in, come in." Hastings clasped his friend's hand, the warmth of the greeting easing his earlier unease. "John, it's good to see you. This place is magnificent. It's home," John said with a shrug, though his eyes flickered with something Hastings couldn't quite place, pride perhaps, or a shadow of discontent. "Mother's made some changes since you last saw it. Come, let's get you settled." The great oak door creaked open, revealing a hall of polished wood and ancestral portraits. The air inside was cool, scented with beeswax and the faint sweetness of roses from a vase on a side table. A maid, young and quick, took Hastings' coat and hat, her eyes darting nervously as she curtsied. John led the way to a drawing-room where a fire crackled despite the summer warmth, casting a golden glow over plush armchairs and a heavy mahogany table. "Mother's upstairs, I expect," John said, pouring two glasses of sherry from a decanter. "She's been a bit under the weather, but she's keen to see you. You'll meet the rest of the household at dinner, quite a crowd we've got these days." Hastings took the glass, savouring the amber liquid's warmth. "A crowd, I thought. It was just you and Lawrence and your mother." John's laugh was short, almost brittle. "Oh, things have changed since Father died. Mother's remarried, you know." Alfred Inglethorpe's the new lord of the manor, for better or worse. Then there's Mary, my wife, and Cynthia Murdoch, mother's ward, and Evelyn Howard, she's mother's companion, or so she calls herself. Bit of a dragon, that one. The mention of Alfred Inglethorpe brought a slight edge to John's tone, and Hastings raised an eyebrow. Not fond of the new stepfather, eh? John hesitated, swirling his sherry. Let's just say he's not what I expected for mother. But you'll see for yourself. Come, I'll show you to your room. They climbed a grand staircase, its baluster worn smooth by generations, and Hastings couldn't help but notice the portraits lining the walls, stern-faced men, and women in ruffled collars and powdered wigs, their eyes seeming to follow him. His room was on the second floor, a spacious chamber with a four-poster bed and a window overlooking the gardens. The scent of lavender drifted in, mingling with the musty comfort of old wood. "Rest up, Arthur," John said, lingering at the door. "Dinner's at 7. You'll meet the whole lot then, and well, brace yourself. It's not the quiet retreat you might have hoped for." The door closed, and Hastings sank onto the bed, the springs creaking softly. John's words lingered, stirring the prickle of unease again. He unpacked his suitcase, hanging his spare uniform and civilian clothes in a wardrobe that smelled faintly of cedar. The room was quiet, save for the distant ticking of a clock, but the silence felt heavy, as though the house itself were listening. As evening approached, Hastings dressed for dinner, choosing a simple suit that felt oddly formal after months. In khaki, he descended to the dining room, where the table was set with gleaming silver and crystal, a chandelier casting prisms of light across the walls. The household was already assembling, and John introduced him with a flourish. "Everyone. This is Captain Arthur Hastings, my old friend from school, and the front. Arthur, meet the family." Emily Inglethorpe stood at the head of the table, a commanding figure despite her age. Her hair was silver, swept into an elegant chignon, and her eyes were sharp, missing nothing. She wore a deep green dress that seemed to absorb the light, and her smile was warm but measured. "Captain Hastings, what a pleasure," she said, her voice smooth as velvet. "John has spoken so fondly of you." "Thank you, Mrs. Inglethorpe," Hastings replied, bowing slightly. "It's an honor to be here." Beside her stood Alfred Inglethorpe, a man whose presence seemed at odds with the grandeur of Styles. He was thin, with a sallow complexion and a beard that did little to hide his weak chin. His eyes darted nervously, and his handshake was limp, almost clammy. "Delighted, Captain," he murmured, though his tone lacked conviction. "Mary Cavendish." John's wife was a shrinking contrast tall, with dark hair and a cool, appraising gaze. She offered a polite nod, her smile fleeting. Lawrence Cavendish, John's younger brother, was quieter, his poet's face pale and thoughtful, as though he carried some private burden. Cynthia Murdoch, a bright-eyed young woman with a quick laugh, seemed the liveliest of the group, her auburn curls bouncing as she greeted Hastings warmly. And then there was Evelyn Howard, a stout woman with a no-nonsense air and a grip like iron. "Captain," she said brusquely, her eyes narrowing as though sizing him up, "you're here to rest, I hear. Good luck with that in this house." Dinner was a lavish affair: roast, pheasant, creamed potatoes, and a claret that warmed Hastings' throat, but the conversation was stilted, punctuated by silences that felt too long. Emily presided with grace, but Alfred's attempts at charm fell flat. Earning subtle eye-rolls from John, Evelyn spoke little, her gaze often fixed on Alfred with undisguised contempt. Mary and Lawrence exchanged quiet words, while Cynthia tried to lighten the mood with talk of the village fete. As the meal progressed, Hastings noticed small tensions: a sharp glance from Mary when John mentioned a business venture, a curt reply from Emily when Alfred suggested alterations to the garden. The air seemed thick with unspoken grievances, and Hastings found himself watching the interactions like a play, each gesture revealing more than words. After dinner, the party moved to the drawing room for coffee. Emily excused herself early, claiming a headache, and Alfred followed, his departure prompting a low mutter from Evelyn. "That man," she said under her breath, loud enough for Hastings to hear. He's no good for her. Mark my words." Curious, Hastings leaned closer. "Trouble with Mr. Inglethorpe?" he asked quietly. Evelyn's eyes flashed. "Trouble? He's a leech, Captain. Married her for her money, plain as day. And those looks he gives that rakes woman in the village disgraceful. Emily's too good for him, but she won't hear. A word against him." Hastings frowned, filing the information away. He sipped his coffee, its bitterness sharp on his tongue, and glanced at John, who was deep in conversation with Mary. The room felt smaller now, the fire's warmth unable to dispel the chill of suspicion that lingered later. As he retired to his room, Hastings stood at the window, staring out at the darkened gardens. The moon cast long shadows across the lawn, and for a moment he thought. He saw a figure move near the hedge of fleeting shape, gone before he could be sure. He shook his head, blaming the wine and his own tired mind. But as he lay in bed, the creaks and groans of the old house seemed to whisper of secrets, of venom lurking beneath the surface of Styles Court. Sleep came slowly, and when it did, it was filled with fragmented dreams of locked doors, shadowed figures, and a woman's voice crying out in the night. When he awoke the next morning, the sunlight streaming through the curtains did little to dispel the sense that he had stepped into a house where every smile hid a motive, every glance held a warning. Styles Court, the venomous villa. John's jaw tightened. Evelyn's got to be in her bonnet about him. Always has. Mother's happy, or so she says, but well, Alfred's not exactly one of us. He's got no breeding, no backbone, and there's talk in the village about him and Mrs. Raikes. Mother won't hear it, though. Mrs. Raikes, Hastings asked, intrigued. A widow in the village. Bit of a siren, if you ask me. Mary's seen them together, and it's caused a row or two. John kicked at a pebble, his frustration clear. I just want Mother to be safe, you know. She's got the money, the power. People take advantage. Hastings nodded, his mind turning. He had no reason to distrust Alfred himself, but the man's nervous demeanour and the household's obvious resentment were hard to ignore. He resolved to keep his eyes open, to watch for any sign of the venom Evelyn spoke of. That evening, as the household gathered for tea, Emily seemed unusually animated. Discussing plans for a charity event, Alfred hovered at her side, his smile strained, and Hastings caught Evelyn muttering to Cynthia about that man's scheming. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and when Emily retired early again, claiming fatigue, Hastings felt a pang of concern. He lingered in the drawing-room, nursing a brandy, when he overheard a heated exchange outside the window. Creeping closer, he peered through the glass to see Mary and John in the garden, their voices low-stacked with anger. "You're being absurd, John," Mary hissed. "Bauerstein's a friend, nothing more. Bauerstein's a poison expert, Mary, and you're spending too much time with him." John shot back. "What am I supposed to think?" Hastings pulled back, his heart racing. Dr. Bauerstein, a local physician with a reputation for toxicology, had visited Styles twice that week, his charm and sharp intellect drawing Mary's attention. Could there be more to John's jealousy? Was Bauerstein's expertise in poisons mere coincidence? The night deepened and Hastings lay awake, the house's creaks louder now, as though it were alive with secrets. He thought of Emily, frail yet commanding, and of Alfred, whose every gesture seemed calculated. The villa's beauty masked something darker, a venom that seeped through its walls, poisoning trust and sowing discord. On the morning of July 18th, the calm shattered. Hastings awoke to screams echoing through the house, followed by the sound of running feet. He threw on a dressing gown and rushed downstairs, where Cynthia stood pale and trembling in the hall. "It's Mrs. Inglethorpe," she whispered. She's dying." Hastings followed her to Emily's bedroom, where the door stood ajar, revealing a scene of chaos. Emily lay on her bed, her face contorted in agony, her hands clutching at the sheets. John and Mary were there, John shouting for a doctor, Mary pressing a cloth to Emily's forehead. Alfred stood frozen in the corner, his eyes wide with panic. "What happened?" Hastings demanded, his voice sharp. "Poison," Evelyn snapped, pushing past him. It's got to be poison. Look at her strychnine. I'd wager someone's done this to her." Emily's gasps grew weaker, her body convulsing as the household stood helpless. Hastings' mind raced, his war-honed instincts kicking in. He needed help, someone with a mind sharper than his own, someone who could see through the venomous web of Styles Court. And then it hit him, Hercule Poirot, the fastidious Belgian detective living nearby, a man whose little grey cells had unravelled mysteries Hastings could scarcely fathom. As Emily's breathing stilled and the room fell silent, Hastings knew the venomous villa had claimed its first victim. The game was afoot, and only Poirot could uncover the truth hidden in the shadows of Styles Court. Chapter 2. Shadows of Suspicion. The morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Styles Court, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished oak floors of the drawing-room. Captain Arthur Hastings, still stiff from his war injuries, sat gingerly in a high-backed armchair, his cane resting against its arm. The grandeur of the Elizabethan manor, with its intricate plasterwork and towering windows, was undeniable, yet an oppressive air clung to the place as if the very walls whispered secrets. His arrival the previous evening had been warm enough. John Cavendish, his old friend, had greeted him with a hearty handshake and a glass of brandy, but Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The household, though outwardly cordial, seemed to pulse with unspoken tensions, like a tightly wound spring waiting to snap. John had invited him to Styles Court to recuperate after months in a military hospital, and Hastings had accepted eagerly, craving the quiet of the Essex countryside. Yet, as he sipped his tea, the clink of the porcelain cup against its saucer seemed to echo louder than it should, amplifying the unease that had settled in his chest. The venomous villa, as he'd privately dubbed it, wasn't just a nickname. Born of whimsy, there was a malice here, subtle but palpable. Woven into the interactions of its inhabitants. The drawing-room door swung open, and John Cavendish strode in, his broad shoulders filling the frame. At 35, he was a handsome man, with a square jaw and dark hair just beginning to grey at the temples. His easy smile, however, didn't quite reach his eyes, which darted nervously as he greeted Hastings. "Sleep well, old chap?" John asked, settling into a chair opposite. His tone was light, but his fingers drummed restlessly on the armrest. "Well enough," Hastings replied, forcing a smile. "Though I confess, this place has an atmosphere about it, hard to put my finger on." John's laugh was a touch too loud. "Atmosphere? You've been reading too many of those Gothic novels, Hastings. Styles is just an old pile of stones, nothing more." But Hastings wasn't convinced. The previous evening, as he'd unpacked in his guest room, he'd overheard raised voices drifting up from the floor below, a woman's sharp tone, followed by a man's low, placating murmur. He hadn't caught the words, but the cadence suggested a choral, one that had been abruptly silenced when footsteps approached. He considered mentioning it to John, but decided against it. He was a guest, after all, and prying into family matters on his first morning seemed gauche. Before he could change his mind, the door opened again, and Mary Cavendish entered. John's wife was striking, with high cheekbones and auburn hair swept into an elegant chignon. Her green eyes, sharp and assessing, lingered on Hastings for a moment before softening into a polite smile. "Good morning, Captain Hastings," she said, her voice smooth but carrying an edge like silk over steel. "I trust you're settling in." "Quite well, thank you," Hastings replied, rising slightly in his chair before his aching leg reminded him to stay put. "This is a splendid house." Mary's smile tightened and she glanced at John, who was now staring intently at his teacup. "Yes, splendid," she echoed, her tone flat. She crossed to the sideboard, where a silver tray held a decanter of sherry and a few glasses, and poured herself a small measure. It was barely 10 o'clock, and Hastings raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The awkward silence was broken by the arrival of Lawrence Cavendish, John's younger brother. Where John was robust and gregarious, Lawrence was slight and reserved, with a poet's pallor and a habit of adjusting his spectacles when nervous. He murmured a greeting and sank into a chair near the fireplace, opening a book but not reading it, his eyes flicking toward the door as if expecting someone. "Lawrence, you look like you've seen a ghost," John said, attempting levity. "What's got you so jumpy?" Lawrence's lips twitched, but he didn't reply, his fingers tightening around the book. Hastings noted the exchange, his curiosity piqued. The brothers were close in age, yet their demeanors couldn't be more different. John carried himself with the confidence of a man accustomed to being heard, while Lawrence seemed perpetually on edge as if braced for an unseen blow. The household's matriarch, Emily Inglethorpe, entered next, her presence commanding the room. At 60, she was a formidable woman, her silver hair pinned neatly beneath a lace cap, her posture ramrod straight. Her wealth, inherited from her late first husband, was the backbone of Styles Court, and she wielded it with an authority that left no doubt as to who ruled the roost. Yet there was a warmth to her, a maternal quality that softened her sharp edges. She greeted Hastings with genuine affection, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as she inquired about his health. "I'm so pleased you're here, Captain," she said, her voice rich with sincerity. "John speaks so highly of you. You must make yourself at home." "Thank you, Mrs. Inglethorpe," Hastings replied, warmed by her kindness but unable to ignore the faint strain in her smile, as if she, too, carried a burden she wasn't sharing. Behind her stood Alfred Inglethorpe, her husband of less than a year. At least 20 years her junior, Alfred was a tall, weary man with a neatly trimmed beard and a penchant for loud waistcoats. His manners were impeccable, almost too polished, and his eyes, dark and unreadable, seemed to take in everything while revealing nothing. He nodded at Hastings, his greeting formal but distant, and took a seat beside Emily, his hand resting possessively on hers. Hastings observed the couple, noting the subtle discomfort that rippled through the room at Alfred's presence. John's jaw tightened, Mary's fingers paused on her glass, and Lawrence's book slipped slightly in his grasp. It was no secret that Emily's marriage to Alfred had caused a stir. John had mentioned it briefly the night before, his tone clipped. "Mother's choice, not ours." The implication was clear. Alfred was an outsider, tolerated but not embraced. The final members of the household arrived together: Cynthia Murdoch, a vivacious young woman with a cascade of chestnut curls, and Evelyn Howard, Emily's companion and distant cousin. Cynthia, an orphan taken in by Emily, was a breath of fresh air, her laughter brightening the room as she recounted a story about a mishap at the local dispensary where she worked. Evelyn, however, was a stark contrast, a sturdy, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s, her face set in a perpetual scowl. She sat beside Emily, her eyes darting to Alfred with undisguised contempt. "Really, Emily, you must be careful with that man," Evelyn said abruptly, her voice cutting through Cynthia's chatter. "He's not what he seems." The room fell silent. Emily's face flushed and she withdrew her hand from Alfred's. "Evelyn, please," she said softly, but there was steel in her tone. "This is neither the time nor the place." Alfred smiled thinly, his fingers brushing the brim of his hat, which rested on his knee. "Miss Howard's candor is always refreshing," he said, his voice smooth but laced with mockery, "though I assure you, my intentions are nothing but honorable." Evelyn snorted, folding her arms. "Honorable? I've seen snakes with more honor." "Evelyn," Emily snapped, her composure fraying. "That's enough." Hastings shifted uncomfortably, his tea forgotten, the venom in Evelyn's words confirmed. His earlier impression this household was a powder keg, and Alfred Inglethorpe was the spark. He glanced at John, expecting him to intervene, but John was staring out the window, his expression unreadable. Mary, meanwhile, had drained her sherry and was pouring another, her movements deliberate. Cynthia, ever the peacemaker, jumped in. "Oh, let's not spoil the morning with arguments. Captain Hastings, have you seen the gardens yet? They're simply divine this time of year." Hastings seized the lifeline. "Not yet, but I'd love to. Perhaps you could show me later?" "Of course." Cynthia beamed, and the tension eased slightly. Though Evelyn's scowl remained fixed on Alfred Dot as breakfast was served, the conversation turned to safer topics: the weather, the state of the roads, the upcoming village fete. But Hastings couldn't shake the memory of the quarrel he'd overheard the previous night. The woman's voice had been sharp, accusing, and now he wondered if it had been Evelyn confronting Alfred, or perhaps Emily herself. The man's voice had been harder to place low, almost soothing, but with an undercurrent of menace. Could it have been Alfred, or someone else entirely, after breakfast? Hastings excused himself to explore the grounds, hoping the fresh air would clear his head. The gardens were as Cynthia had promised, a riot of roses and neatly trimmed hedges, but his thoughts kept drifting back to the drawing room. The dynamics of the household were a puzzle, each member a piece that didn't quite fit. John and Mary's marriage seemed strained, though they maintained a polite facade. Lawrence's nervous demeanor suggested he was hiding something, or perhaps he was simply overwhelmed by the family's dramas. Cynthia's cheerfulness felt genuine, but even she had moments of hesitation, as if she, too, sensed the undercurrents. And even her outspoken distrust of Alfred was either bravely honest or dangerously reckless. As he rounded a corner of the garden path, Hastings nearly collided with a man he hadn't yet met. The stranger was tall and lean, with sharp features and a mop of dark hair. He introduced himself as Dr. Bauerstein, a toxicologist staying at the village inn, but a frequent visitor to Styles. His manner was charming, almost too much so, and his eyes lingered on Mary Cavendish when she joined, then briefly to offer tea. "Captain Hastings, is it?" Bauerstein said, shaking his hand with a firm grip. "I hear you're a friend of John's. Splendid to have fresh blood at Styles. It can get rather stifling here." Hastings laughed politely, but the word stifling rang true. "It's a beautiful place," he said, "but I confess there's a certain tension in the air." Bauerstein's smile was knowing. "Oh, you've noticed." "Have you?" Families like the Cavendishes are breeding grounds for drama. Money, marriage. Secrets, it's a potent mix. Mary's arrival cut the conversation short, and Bauerstein excused himself, leaving Hastings with the distinct impression that the doctor knew more than he let on. Mary's demeanor shifted in Bauerstein's presence. Her posture softened, her smile more genuine, and Hastings wondered if there was more to their acquaintance than met the eye. That afternoon, as the household gathered for luncheon, the tension from breakfast lingered. Emily, usually the anchor of decorum, seemed distracted, her eyes darting to Alfred whenever he spoke. Evelyn's barbs were less overt, but no less pointed, and John's attempts at humour fell flat. Lawrence barely spoke, his gaze fixed on his plate, while Cynthia chattered nervously as if trying to fill the silence. It was during this meal that Hastings overheard another fragment of conversation, this time between Mary and John as they stepped into the hall. He hadn't meant to eavesdrop, but their voices carried through the open door. "You're being ridiculous, John," Mary said, her tone sharp. "There's nothing to it. Nothing." John's voice was low, but the anger was unmistakable. "I see the way he looks at you, Mary, and you don't exactly discourage it." Hastings froze, his fork halfway to his mouth. Were they talking about Bauerstein? The thought gnawed at him, adding another layer to the household's tangled web. He glanced at Emily, who was engaged in a quiet conversation with Alfred, oblivious to the drama unfolding just outside Dot. As the day wore on, Hastings found himself cataloguing the household's interactions, each one a clue to the underlying discord. Evelyn's distrust of Alfred was the most overt, but there were subtler signs. The way John's hand tightened on his glass when Alfred spoke, the flicker of unease in Lawrence's eyes when Emily mentioned her will, the guarded glances Mary exchanged with Bauerstein during his brief visit. And then there was the quarrel from the previous night, its echoes lingering in Hastings' mind. He couldn't be sure who the voices belonged to, but the woman's tone had carried a raw edge of betrayal, and the man's response had been too calm, to calculated. By evening, as the household gathered in the library for after-dinner drinks, the atmosphere was thicker than ever. Emily retired early, pleading a headache, and Alfred followed her, his hand on her elbow in a gesture that seemed more possessive than affectionate. Evelyn watched them go, her lips pressed into a thin line, and then excused herself abruptly. Muttering about needing air. Hastings lingered, nursing a brandy and observing the remaining members of the household. John and Mary sat on opposite sides of the room, their silence louder than any argument. Lawrence had retreated to a corner with his book, though his eyes were on the door, as if expecting Evelyn's return. Cynthia, for once, was subdued, her fingers twisting a handkerchief as she stared into the fire. It was then that Hastings heard it again, a raised voice, this time from the direction of Emily's boudoir upstairs. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable, a woman angry, accusing, followed by a man's low murmur. The quarrel was brief, cut off by the sound of a door slamming, and then silence. He glanced at John, who had heard it too, his face darkening. "Mother's been on edge lately," he said, as if to explain it away, but his voice lacked conviction. Hastings nodded, but his mind was racing. The venomous villa was living up to its name, its inhabitants caught in a web of resentment, suspicion, and secrets. He didn't yet know how they all connected, but he was certain of one thing: the malice he'd sensed wasn't imaginary. It was real, and it was growing, like a shadow lengthening across the polished floors of Styles Court. As he retired to his room that night, Hastings couldn't shake the image of Emily Inglethorpe's strained smile, or the cold glint in Alfred's eyes, or Evelyn's venomous words. The pieces of the puzzle were there, scattered before him, but they refused to fit together. Not yet, but as he drifted into an uneasy sleep, he couldn't help but feel that the quarrel he'd overheard was only the beginning, a prelude to something far more sinister. The next morning, the household awoke to a new day, but the shadows of suspicion had only deepened. Emily's mood was brittle, her interactions with Alfred formal and strained. Evelyn's hostility was barely contained, her every glance at Alfred laced with contempt. John and Mary moved around each other like strangers, their conversation limited to polite necessities. Lawrence seemed more withdrawn than ever, his book a shield against the world. And Cynthia, though she tried to maintain her brightness, couldn't hide the worry in her eyes. Hastings spent the day exploring the estate, hoping to clear his mind, but the questions followed him. Who had been arguing with Emily? Was it Alfred, as Evelyn so clearly believed? Or was there another player in this drama, someone whose motives were less obvious? Dr. Baustein's name kept surfacing, his charm and familiarity with the household an unsettling contrast to the tension within. By late afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the Essex countryside, Hastings found himself in the library, leafing through a volume of local history. The room was quiet, save for the ticking of a grandfather clock and the occasional creak of the house settling. He was alone, or so he thought, until he heard footsteps behind him. Turning, he saw Evelyn Howard, her face pale but resolute. "Captain Hastings," she said, her voice low, "I need to speak with you." Privately, he set the book aside, his pulse quickening. "Of course, Miss Howard. What is it?" She glanced at the door, ensuring they were alone, then leaned closer. "It's about Alfred Inglethorpe. I don't trust him, and neither should you. He's up to something, and Emily's too blind to see it." Hastings hesitated, unsure how to respond. Evelyn's bluntness was disarming, but her intensity suggested she knew more than she was letting on. "What makes you so certain?" he asked carefully. Her eyes narrowed. "I've seen his type before. Charming, calculating, always angling for something. Emily's money. Her estate, it's all he cares about. And that woman, Mrs. Raikes. In the village, he's been seen with her, whispering in corners. It's not right." The mention of Mrs. Raikes was new, and Hastings filed it away. "Have you spoken to Mrs. Inglethorpe about this?" Evelyn's laugh was bitter. "Oh, I've tried. She won't hear a word against him. Says I'm being unkind. But mark my words, Captain, that man's trouble. And if something happens to Emily, you'll know where to look." Before Hastings could press her further, the door opened and Alfred himself stepped in. Evelyn stiffened, her face a mask of disdain, and excused herself without a word. Alfred watched her go, his expression unreadable, then turned to Hastings with a polite smile. "Miss Howard seems out of sorts," he remarked, his tone light but his eyes sharp. "I hope she hasn't been filling your head with nonsense." Hastings murmured something non-committal, but his mind was racing. Evelyn's warning, coupled with the overheard quarrels and the household's fractured dynamics, painted a picture of a family on the brink. The venomous villa wasn't just a clever turn of phrase, it was a warning, one that Hastings feared would soon be proven all too true. As the day drew to a close, the storm broke, rain lashing against the windows of Styles Court. The household gathered for dinner, but the meal was a tense affair, punctuated by strained silences and forced pleasantries. Emily's attempts to steer the conversation to neutral topics faltered, and Alfred's presence seemed to cast a pall over the table. Evelyn barely spoke, her eyes fixed on her plate, while John and Mary exchanged glances that spoke of unspoken grievances. Lawrence, as usual, was a shadow, his presence barely registered. Hastings retired early, his head spinning with questions. The quarrels, the suspicions, the undercurrents of betrayal, they were all pieces of a puzzle he couldn't yet solve. But as he lay in bed, listening to the rain and the distant creak of the old house, he couldn't shake the feeling that the shadows of suspicion were only the beginning. Something was coming, something dark and inevitable, and Styles Court was at its heart. Chapter 3. The night of the poisoned night of July 18th. At Styles Court descended with an oppressive weight, as if the very air knew what was to come. The grand house, nestled in the quiet Essex countryside, stood silent under a moonless sky, its ivy-clad walls hiding the turmoil within. Captain Arthur Hastings, still adjusting to the rhythms of civilian life after the war, lay restless in his guest room. The creak of old wood and the distant howl of a summer breeze through the estate's gardens kept him from sleep. But it was not the house's natural sounds that stirred his unease, it was the undercurrent of tension he had sensed since arriving at Styles Court. The day had been warm, the kind of sticky July heat that clung to the skin and frayed tempers. Dinner had been a strained affair, with Emily Inglethorpe presiding over the table like a queen, her presence commanding yet brittle. Her husband, Alfred, 20 years her junior, had been unusually quiet, his eyes darting nervously when he thought no one was watching. John Cavendish, Emily's stepson, had made little effort to hide his resentment toward Alfred, his jaw tight as he cut into his roast. Mary Cavendish, John's wife, had been distant, her usual poise replaced by a distracted air. Lawrence, John's younger brother, had barely spoken, lost in his own thoughts, while Cynthia Murdoch, the lively young protégée of Emily, tried to lighten the mood with forced chatter. Evelyn Howard, Emily's companion, had been the most outspoken, her sharp remarks about Alfred cutting through the polite facade like a knife. Hastings, ever the observer, noted it all but could not piece together the puzzle. As midnight approached, Hastings tossed in his bed, the events of the evening replaying in his mind. He had overheard fragments of a heated exchange earlier, though he could not place the voices. Raised tones had drifted from the drawing-room, words like betrayal and fortune cutting through the closed door. He had dismissed it as family squabbles, but now, in the dark, those words felt heavier, laden with meaning he could not yet grasp. A sudden cry shattered the silence. It was sharp, guttural, a sound of raw agony that sent Hastings bolt upright. His heart pounded as he fumbled for his dressing gown, the floor cold beneath his bare feet. The cry came again, weaker this time, followed by a thud that echoed through the house. He flung open his door and stepped into the corridor, where dim gaslight cast long shadows. Other doors were opening. Now John Cavendish appeared, his face pale, his nightshirt askew. Mary followed, her dark hair loose, her eyes wide with alarm. Cynthia's voice called out from her room, high and trembling. "What's happened? Is someone hurt?" "It's Mother," John said, his voice tight. He was already moving toward Emily Inglethorpe's bedroom at the end of the hall, where the sounds had originated. Hastings followed, his pulse racing, a sense of dread settling in his chest. The heavy oak door to Emily's room was closed, and John rattled the handle. It was locked. "Mother, Mother, are you all right?" John pounded on the door, his fists shaking the frame. There was no answer, only a faint, choking gasp from within. Mary clutched her husband's arm, her face ashen. "Break it down," she urged, her voice barely above a whisper. Hastings hesitated, his military instincts warring with the propriety of the moment. But John needed no encouragement. He threw his shoulder against the door, once, twice, until the wood splintered around the lock and gave way. The group spilled into the room, and what they saw stopped them cold. Emily Inglethorpe lay sprawled across her bed, her body contorted in a grotesque arch, her face twisted in pain. Her nightgown was tangled around her limbs, and her hands clawed at the air as if fighting an invisible foe. Her eyes, wide and glassy, stared at nothing, and her lips moved faintly, forming words no one could hear. A thin froth gathered at the corner of her mouth, and her breathing came in ragged, shuddering gasps. "Dear God," Mary whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. John rushed to his stepmother's side, grasping her hand. "Mother, hold on. We'll get help." But Emily's body convulsed violently, her back arching further, her fingers tightening around John's with unnatural strength. Then, with a final, choking cry, she went still. Her eyes remained open, fixed on some distant horror. Hastings stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the scene. He had seen death before on battlefields, in hospitals, but this was different. This was not the clean finality of war. This was something deliberate, malicious. Cynthia, who had followed them into the room, let out a sob and turned away, burying her face in Mary's shoulder. Lawrence appeared in the doorway, his face pale, his hands trembling. "Is she—" he began, but the question died on his lips. John straightened, his expression a mix of grief and fury. "She's gone," he said, his voice breaking. "Someone's done this to her." The word hung in the air. Murder? No one spoke it, but it was there, as palpable as the heat still lingering in the room. Hastings' eyes darted around, taking in the details. The locked door, now broken. A coffee cup on the bedside table, its contents half spilled. A crumpled piece of paper on the floor, partially burned, and the faint smell of something bitter, almost medicinal, lingering in the air. "We need a doctor," Mary said, her voice steadier now, though her hands shook. "And the police." "I'll go," Lawrence offered, his voice hollow. He turned and disappeared down the corridor, his footsteps echoing in the silent house. Hastings knelt beside the bed, his training urging him to act, though he knew it was too late. He checked Emily's pulse, confirming what they all knew. Her skin was still warm, but there was no life in her. As he stood, his gaze fell on the coffee cup again. Something about it nagged at him, an instinct, perhaps, born of his time with a certain Belgian detective whose methods had left an impression. Poirot. Hastings said aloud, the name bursting from him like a revelation. "We need Hercule Poirot." John turned, his brow furrowed. "Your detective friend, the one in the village, yes," Hastings said, already moving toward the door. "If anyone can make sense of this, it's him. I'll fetch him at once." Mary nodded, her face resolute despite the tears in her eyes. "Hurry, Arthur. We can't let whoever did this get away." Hastings grabbed his coat from his room and rushed downstairs, the grand staircase blurring past him. The night air was cool as he stepped outside, the gravel crunching under his boots as he made for the stables. Styles Court was remote, but the village of Styles, St. Mary, was only a mile away, and Poirot had taken up residence there after retiring from his work in London. Hastings saddled a horse, his hands fumbling with the straps in his haste, and rode into the darkness. The image of Emily's twisted body burned into his mind. The ride to the village was a blur, the horse's hoofs pounding against the dirt road. Hastings' thoughts raced as fast as his mount. Who could have done this? Alfred, with his shifty eyes and convenient absence from dinner. Evelyn, whose venomous words about him had set the household on edge, or someone else entirely lurking in the shadows of that sprawling estate. And why poison? It was a coward's weapon, cold and calculated, requiring access and opportunity. He reached Poirot's modest cottage just before 1 in the morning. The windows were dark, but Hastings pounded on the door, his urgency overriding decorum. After a moment, A light flickered on, and the door opened to reveal Hercule Poirot. Impeccably dressed despite the hour, his moustache perfectly waxed, his green eyes sharp and alert. "Mon ami Hastings," Poirot exclaimed, his voice tinged with surprise but no trace of sleepiness. "What brings you here at such an hour? You are distressed, non?" "It's Emily Inglethorpe," Hastings said, breathless. "She's dead poisoned, we think. At Styles Court. You must come at once." Poirot's expression shifted, his eyes narrowing. "Poisoned, you say? Say grave. Wait one moment, Hastings. I will gather my things." True to his word, Poirot was ready in minutes, his small frame bundled in a coat, a scarf tucked neatly around his neck. He carried a leather satchel, no doubt filled with the tools of his trade notebooks. Magnifying glass, perhaps even those mysterious vials he sometimes used for chemical tests. They took the horse back to Styles, Poirot clinging to Hastings with surprising strength for a man of his size. As they approached the house, its lights now blazing against the night, Poirot's silence was unnerving. Hastings knew that silence. Well, it meant the little Belgian's mind was already at work, his little grey cells piecing together possibilities from the scant details Hastings had provided. They entered the house to find the household in disarray. John was pacing the drawing-room, his face drawn. Mary sat by the fireplace, staring into the flames, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Cynthia was curled up on a sofa, her eyes red from crying. Lawrence had returned with Dr. Wilkins, the local physician, who was upstairs examining the body. Evelyn Howard was conspicuously absent, as was Alfred Inglethorpe. Poirot took in the scene with a single glance, his head tilted slightly, like a bird assessing its surroundings. "Tell me everything, Hastings," he said, his voice calm but commanding. "From the moment you arrived at Styles Court," Hastings recounted the day, the strained dinner, the overheard argument, the cry in the night, the locked door, and Emily's horrific death. Poirot listened without interruption, his fingers steepled, his eyes half closed. When Hastings finished, Poirot nodded slowly, and the coffee cup he asked. Chapter 4. Poirot's little grey-celsed morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Styles Court, casting long, wavering shadows across the polished oak floors. Captain Arthur Hastings stood by the window in the drawing-room, his hands clasped behind his back, his mind a tumult of unease. The events of the previous night, the ghastly discovery of Emily Inglethorpe's death, her agonized cries echoing through the house had left him shaken. The air in the grand old manor felt thick with suspicion, as though the very walls whispered secrets they dared not speak aloud. He turned at the sound of precise, measured footsteps approaching, and there, entering with his characteristic air, a fastidious confidence, was Hercule Poirot. Poirot was a small man, hardly taller than 5 feet 4 inches, but his presence filled the room. His head was egg-shaped, tilted slightly to one side, and his meticulously groomed moustache curled at the ends with a precision that seemed almost mathematical. His green eyes gleamed with an intensity that made Hastings feel as though the Belgian could see straight through to his very thoughts. Dressed in a neatly pressed suit, his patent leather shoes gleaming, Poirot carried himself with the dignity of a man who knew his worth. Hastings, still rattled from the night's horrors, felt a wave of relief at his friend's arrival. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice smooth and accented, "you look as though you have seen a ghost. But it is not ghosts we chase today, no? It is something far more tangible, a murderer." He tapped his temple lightly. "And it is here, with the little grey cells, that we shall find them." Hastings managed a weak smile. "I'm glad you're here, Poirot. This business sits ghastly. Emily Inglethorpe, poisoned in her own bed. And that locked door, it's unnatural. I can't make heads or tails of it." Poirot's eyes twinkled with amusement, though his expression remained serious. "Unnatural, you say? Non. Hastings, it is all too natural. A crime such as this, it is planned, it is deliberate. The locked door, the poison, these are not accidents. They are the work of a mind, and it is that mind we must uncover." He moved toward the center of the room, his gaze sweeping over the furnishings with a scrutiny that missed nothing. The drawing-room was elegant but oppressive. its heavy velvet curtains and dark wood paneling lending it a somber air. A large fireplace dominated one wall, its mantel adorned with porcelain figurines and a silver clock that ticked with an almost accusatory rhythm. Poirot paused by a small table, where a delicate china coffee cup sat, its contents long since cold. This, he said, lifting the cup by its handle with a handkerchief, is most interesting. Tell me, Hastings, who drank coffee last night? Hastings frowned, trying to recall the chaotic events of the evening. I believe Emily had coffee after dinner. She always did. In the drawing-room with the family. Cynthia poured it, I think, or was it Mary? I can't be sure. Poirot's moustache twitched. You must be sure. Mon ami. Precision is everything. The coffee cup. It is not merely a vessel for a beverage. It is a clue, perhaps the clue. We must know who handled it, who served it, who drank from it. He placed the cup back on the table, with care, as though it were a priceless artifact. Hastings watched, fascinated despite his agitation. Poirot's methodical nature was both infuriating and reassuring. Where Hastings saw only chaos, Poirot saw patterns, threads to be woven into. A tapestry of truth. The Belgian detective moved to the fireplace, where a small pile of ashes caught his eye. He knelt, producing a pair of tweezers from his pocket, and extracted a tiny fragment of paper, no larger than a postage stamp, its edges charred. And this, Poirot murmured, holding the fragment to the light, what do we have here? A piece of a will, perhaps, or a letter. The flames have not been kind, but they have not destroyed everything. Hastings peered over his shoulder, squinting at the blackened scrap. Oh, well, you think Emily was changing her will. There was talk. You know, John and Lawrence were furious about her new marriage. To Alfred, they thought he was after her money. Poirot nodded, his expression inscrutable. Money, Hastings. Always it comes back to money, or love, or revenge. These are the pillars of motive, and we shall find which one holds up this crime. He slipped the fragment into a small envelope, which he tucked into his pocket. Come, let us see the room where Madame Inglethorpe met her fate. They ascended. The grand staircase, its baluster gleaming under the morning light. Styles Court was a labyrinth of corridors and rooms, each more imposing than the last. Emily Inglethorpe's bedroom was at the end of a long hallway, its heavy oak door still locked, as it had been when the household discovered her body. Dorcas, the loyal maid, stood guard outside, her face pale and her hands trembling as she handed Poirot the key. It's dreadful, sir, she whispered. Mrs. Inglethorpe was a good lady, kind to us all. Who could do such a thing? Poirot patted her arm gently. Do not distress yourself. Mademoiselle, Hercule Poirot is here, and he shall find the truth. Now, tell me, this door, it was locked when you found her? Dorcas nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. Locked tight. We had to break it down. Mr. John and Mr. Lawrence did. Oh, it was awful, her lying there, all twisted up. Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. Thank you. Dorcas, you have been most helpful. Now, please, leave us to examine the room. The bedroom was a study in opulence, with a four-poster bed draped in crimson velvet, a mahogany dressing table cluttered with silver-backed brushes and perfume bottles, and a large window overlooking the manicured gardens. The air was heavy, with the scent of lavender undercut by something sharper, more chemical. Emily's body had been removed, but the bed was still unmade. The sheets tangled as though she had thrashed in her final moments. Poirot moved to the bed, his fingers tracing the edge of the mattress. Strychnine, he said softly. A cruel poison. It does not kill gently. The convulsions, the agony, they are unmistakable. But how was it administered, and by whom? Hastings, standing by the dressing table, gestured to a small cocoa tin on a silver tray. She drank cocoa every night, didn't she? Could it have been in that? Poirot's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. The cocoa. Yes, Hastings, you may have stumbled upon something, but we must be careful. The coffee cup, the cocoa tin, these are possibilities, not certainties. We must test, we must verify. He lifted the tin, examining its contents with a critical eye. A faint residue clung to the interior, and he scraped a sample into another of his seemingly endless supply of envelopes. "Poirot," Hastings said, his voice urgent, "I've been thinking. Alfred Inglethorpe, he's the obvious suspect, isn't he? He married Emily for her money. Everyone says so. And he wasn't here last night when she died. Isn't that suspicious?" Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "Obvious, Hastings? The obvious is often a trap. Alfred Inglethorpe may be guilty, or he may be a pawn in someone else's game. We must not jump to conclusions. The little grey cells, they demand evidence, not assumptions." Hastings flushed, feeling chastised but undeterred. "But what about the locked door, if it was locked from the inside? How could anyone have gotten in to poison her?" Poirot's smile widened. "Ah, the locked door. It is a puzzle, is it not? But puzzles are meant to be solved. Consider this. A door may be locked to keep someone out or to make it appear that no one could have entered. We must look beyond the obvious, Hastings. We must see what is not there." He moved to the door, examining the lock with a magnifying glass he produced from yet another pocket. The mechanism was old but sturdy, with no signs of tampering. Poirot's brow furrowed, and he murmured something in French that Hastings couldn't catch. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, he crossed to the window, flinging it open to inspect. The sill and frame, no signs of entry here. He said, almost to himself, the window was locked, the shutters secure, and yet the poison was administered. Interesting, no? Hastings threw up his hands. Interesting? It's maddening. How can you be so calm, Poirot? A woman is dead, and we're no closer to finding her killer. Poirot turned, his expression serene, but his eyes blazing. "Calm, Hastings. I am not calm. I am focused. The mind. It must be clear, like a mirror, to reflect the truth. You see chaos, but I see order. And in that order we shall find our murderer." He returned to the dressing table, his fingers brushing over a small jewelry box. He opened it, revealing a collection of brooches and necklaces, but his attention was drawn to a single hairpin, bent slightly out of shape. He held it up, studying it as though it were a priceless gem. "A hairpin," Hastings said, bewildered. "What does that have to do with anything?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Everything, mon ami, or nothing. That is the beauty of a clue. It waits for us to give it meaning. This hairpin, it is out of place, is it not? Why is it bent? Who bent it? These are the questions we must ask." For the next hour, Poirot moved through the room with the precision of a surgeon, examining every surface, every object. He noted the position of the furniture, the angle of the sunlight through the window, the faint scratches on the floorboards. Near the bed, Hastings followed, trying to keep up with the detective's relentless curiosity. Poirot's questions were endless. Who had access to the room? Who prepared the cocoa? Who handled the coffee? What was the significance of the burned paper? Each query seemed to lead to another, forming a web that Hastings could barely grasp. Chapter 5. The Strychnine puzzled morning. After Hercule Poirot's initial inspection of Styles Court was a sombre affair. The grand dining room, with its polished mahogany table and heavy velvet curtains, felt oppressive under the weight of Emily Inglethorpe's death. The air was thick with unspoken accusations, and the household moved about with the cautious tread of those who know a killer might still walk among them. Captain Arthur Hastings, still shaken by the previous nights chaos, sat at the table, his breakfast untouched, his eyes darting between the faces of those present. John Cavendish, pale and drawn, stirred his coffee absent-mindedly. Mary Cavendish, his wife, sat rigidly, her lips pressed into a thin line. Lawrence Cavendish, John's younger brother, seemed lost in thought, his bookish demeanour more pronounced than ever. Cynthia Murdoch, the young protégée of the late Emily, dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief, while the servants hovered nervously, unsure of their place in this altered world. Hercule Poirot, however, was a study in composure. He entered the room with his characteristic precision, his small frame immaculate in a neatly pressed suit, his moustache perfectly waxed, his green eyes sharp and observant, scanned the room as if it were a chessboard, each person a piece in, a game only he fully understood. Hastings marvelled at his friend's ability to remain unruffled in the face of such a grim situation. Poirot's little grey cells, as he often called them, were already at work, piecing together the puzzle of Emily's death. "Good morning, Miss Amice," Poirot said, his voice calm but carrying an undercurrent of authority. "I trust you have all rested, though I suspect sleep was elusive after last night's tragedy." John Cavendish looked up, his expression a mix of exhaustion and irritation. "Rest? Hardly. The house feels like a tomb, Poirot. What progress have you made? Do you know who did this to my mother?" Poirot raised a hand, his gesture both placating and commanding. "Patience. Monsieur Cavendish, the truth, it is like a fine wine, it requires time to reveal its full bouquet. But rest assured, I have begun my inquiries, and the pieces, they are beginning to align." Hastings, eager to contribute, leaned forward. "The strychnine? Poirot, surely that's the key. It's not something one just stumbles across. Whoever got hold of it must have planned this for some time." Poirot's eyes twinkled with a hint of amusement at Hastings' enthusiasm. "Mon cher Hastings, you are correct that the strychnine is central, but we must not leap to conclusions. The how is important, yes, but the why and the who, they are the heart of the matter. Let us proceed methodically." The detective turned, his attention to the household, his gaze settling on each person in turn. "I would like to speak with each of you today to understand Madame Inglethorpe's final hours. Every detail, no matter how small, may hold the key to this mystery." Mary Cavendish spoke first, her voice steady but laced with tension. "I don't see what more we can tell you, Monsieur Poirot. Emily was fine when we all went to bed. She took her cocoa, as she always did, and retired to her room. None of us could have foreseen this." Poirot nodded, his expression unreadable. "And yet, Madame Cavendish, someone foresaw it. Someone ensured that strychnine found its way into her system. Tell me, who prepared her cocoa last night?" Mary hesitated, glancing at Cynthia. "It was Dorcas, I believe. She's been with us for years, utterly devoted to Emily. Surely you don't suspect her?" "Suspect?" Poirot tilted his head, his tone mild. "I suspect no one and everyone, madam. That is the way of the detective. I merely seek facts. Dorcas, you say very well. I shall speak with her. And you? Mademoiselle Murdoch, you were close to Madame Inglethorpe. Did you notice anything unusual in her behaviour yesterday?" Cynthia, her eyes red from crying, shook her head. She seemed a bit preoccupied, perhaps, but nothing alarming. "She was always so kind to me. Monsieur Poirot, I can't imagine why anyone would want to harm her." Poirot's gaze softened, but only slightly. "Kindness, mademoiselle, does not always protect one from malice. Now, tell me about this cocoa. Was it her custom to drink it every night?" "Yes," Cynthia replied. "Dorcas or one of the maids would bring it to her room around 9 o'clock. It was a ritual. She said it helped her sleep. And last night, who brought it to her?" Poirot pressed. Cynthia frowned, thinking. "I believe it was Dorcas again. I saw her carrying the tray up the stairs." Poirot made a small note in his pocket-book, his movements precise. "Merci, mademoiselle. And you, Monsieur Lawrence, did you see or hear anything unusual last night?" Lawrence, who had been staring at his plate, looked up, startled. "Me? No, nothing. I was in my room, reading. I didn't hear anything until the commotion started when Mary woke us all." Poirot nodded, but his eyes lingered on Lawrence as if weighing his words. "Very well. And Monsieur John, where were you when your mother retired for the night?" John's jaw tightened. "I was in the library, going over some estate papers. Mary and I had a late supper, and then I stayed up to work. I didn't see Mother after dinner." Poirot's attention shifted to Mary. "And you, madam, you were with your husband?" Mary's cheeks flushed slightly, but she met Poirot's gaze. "Yes, we had supper together. Then I went to bed. I didn't see Emily after she went upstairs." The detective closed his pocketbook with a snap. "Bon, I have a starting point. Now, I must examine Madame Inglethorpe's room again, and I would like to speak with Dorcas and the other servants. Hastings, you will accompany me." As the household dispersed, Hastings followed Poirot up the grand staircase to Emily's bedroom. The room was as they had left it, the heavy air of tragedy still lingering. The four-poster bed, now stripped of its linens, stood as a silent witness to the crime. The coffee cup Poirot had noted earlier remained on the bedside table, its contents long since dried. A small cocoa mug, overlooked in the initial chaos, sat nearby, its interior stained with a faint brown residue. Poirot moved to the cup, examining it with care. "This cocoa, Hastings, it interests me greatly, if it was indeed her nightly ritual. It is a likely vehicle for the poison. Strychnine, you see, is bitter, but cocoa is strong enough to mask its taste, especially if the victim is accustomed to it." Hastings frowned. But wouldn't she have noticed something off? Surely strychnine would make her ill immediately. Poirot shook his head. "Not necessarily, mon ami. Strychnine can take time to act, sometimes an hour or more, depending on the dose and the method of administration. If it was mixed into her cocoa, she might have consumed it without suspicion, only to feel its effects later in the night." He turned his attention to the room's other details. The locked door, which had been forced open by John and Dr. Bauerstein, the window, securely fastened from the inside, and the small fireplace, where a fragment of paper part of a will Poirot had deduced had been found. The detective knelt by the fireplace, sifting through the ashes with a small tool. "See here, Hastings," he said, holding up a tiny scrap of paper. "The ink is smudged, but I can make out a few words. 'My dearest and inheritance, this is no accident. Someone wished to destroy this document, but they were not thorough enough.'" Hastings peered over his shoulder. "A will, you think? But whose? Emily's?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "Perhaps, or perhaps it is a letter, a note, something. That points to motive. We must find the rest of it, if it still exists." They moved on to the servants' quarters, where Dorcas, the elderly housemaid, awaited them. She was a sturdy woman with a lined face and a no-nonsense demeanour, but her hands trembled as she spoke of Emily. "She was a good mistress, sir," Dorcas said, her voice thick with emotion. "Always fair, always kind. I can't think who'd do such a wicked thing." Poirot's tone was gentle but firm. "Tell me about last night, Dorcas." "You prepared Madame Inglethorpe's cocoa?" "Yes, sir," Dorcas replied. "I made it in the kitchen. Same as always. Cocoa powder, milk, a bit of sugar, just how she liked it. I took it up to her room at 9, left it on her bedside table. She was writing a letter when I came in, and she seemed a bit distracted, but she smiled and thanked me." "A letter?" Poirot's interest sharpened. "Did you see to whom it was addressed?" Dorcas shook her head. "No, sir. I didn't look. It was folded, and she tucked it away when I came in. I didn't think nothing of it. She often wrote letters in the evening." Poirot exchanged a glance with Hastings, and the cocoa did. "Anyone else handle it after you prepared it?" "No, sir," Dorcas said firmly. "I carried it straight up myself. No one else touched it. I'm sure of it." Poirot thanked her and dismissed her, his mind clearly racing. "A letter, Hastings," he murmured as they returned to the hallway. "It is a thread we must follow. If Madame Inglethorpe was writing something important, it may hold the key to her murder." Their next stop was the inquest, held later that day in the village hall. The room was packed with locals, their whispers buzzing like flies as the coroner called witnesses. Dr. Bauerstein, the poison expert, testified first, his voice calm and clinical. "Strychnine poisoning is unmistakable," he said. "The convulsions, the rigidity of the muscles, the arched back, these are classic symptoms. Based on the autopsy, I estimate the poison was administered between 9 and 10 o'clock last night, likely in a liquid, given the speed of its effect." The coroner, a stern man with a monocle, pressed him. "Could it have been in her coffee or cocoa?" Bauerstein nodded. "Either is possible. Cocoa in particular would mask the taste effectively." Chapter 6. tangled motif as the morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Styles Court, casting a muted glow across the breakfast room where Captain Arthur Hastings sat. His coffee untouched, the events of the previous days weighed heavily on him. The air thick with unease as the household grappled with the grim reality of Emily Inglethorpe's poisoning. The once grand villa, with its polished oak panels and ornate chandeliers, now seemed to harbour a creeping malevolence, its every shadow hiding a secret. Hastings' thoughts churned, replaying the chaos of July 18th, when Emily's agonized cries had shattered the night, her death by strychnine casting suspicion on everyone within these walls. Across the table, John Cavendish sat in brooding silence, his jaw tight as he stared at the morning paper without reading it. His wife, Mary, entered with a forced smile, her elegance marred by the faint lines of strain around her eyes. Lawrence Cavendish, John's younger brother, lingered near the window, his pale face betraying a restless anxiety. Cynthia Murdoch, the young ward of the late Emily, picked at her toast, her usual vivacity dimmed. The absence of Evelyn Howard, who had stormed out after denouncing Alfred Inglethorpe, Emily's much younger husband, left an unspoken tension in the room, and Alfred himself, conspicuously absent this morning, seemed to loom over the gathering like a spectre. Hercule Poirot, the diminutive Belgian detective with his impeccable moustache and gleaming patent leather shoes, had not yet joined them. Hastings, who had known Poirot from their days in Belgium, felt a flicker of relief at the thought of his friend's sharp mind unravelling the mystery. But the complexity of the case, the locked bedroom, the strychnine, the overheard quarrels gnawed at him. Who among this seemingly respectable household could have committed such a calculated act? As the clock struck 9, Poirot appeared in the doorway, his green eyes alight with purpose. Bon matin, Miss Amos, he said, his voice crisp despite the sombre mood. I trust you have all rested, for today we must pursue the truth with vigour. His gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on each face as if reading their thoughts. Hastings noticed Mary stiffen slightly, while John's fingers tightened around his newspaper. Poirot, Hastings ventured, rising from his seat. Have you made any progress? The inquest is tomorrow, and the household is on edge. Surely you've found something to point us toward the culprit? Poirot raised a hand, his expression enigmatic. Patience, mon cher Hastings. The truth, it is like a fine tapestry each. Thread must be examined before the pattern emerges. Today, we shall explore the motives that tangle this household like so many vines. The word motives hung in the air, and Hastings felt a chill. He glanced at John, whose inheritance had been jeopardized by Emily's marriage to Alfred, and at Mary, whose cool demeanour hid something Hastings couldn't quite place. Even Cynthia, with her access to the dispensary, and Lawrence, with his medical knowledge, were not above suspicion. And then there was Dr. Bauerstein, the poison expert who seemed too close to Mary for Hastings' liking. The villa, aptly dubbed venomous by some whispered jest, was indeed a nest of conflicting desires. Poirot began his inquiries with a deceptively casual air, settling into an armchair with a small notebook. Monsieur John, he said, turning to the elder Cavendish, let us speak of the will. Madame Inglethorpe, she was a woman of considerable wealth, nest's paws, and this wealth, it was to pass to her husband, Alfred, upon her death. John's face darkened. Yes, that's what she told us. She made a new will after marrying Alfred, leaving the bulk of her fortune to him. Lawrence and I, well, we were to receive only modest allowances unless she changed her mind again. And did you resent this arrangement? Poirot asked, his tone neutral but his eyes piercing. John hesitated, his fingers crumpling the edge of the newspaper. Resent? I suppose I did. It's only natural. Styles Court has been in our family for generations, and to see it handed over to a man like Alfred, he trailed off, his voice bitter. John, please, Marie interjected, her voice sharp. Alfred was Emily's choice. We must respect that. Poirot's moustache twitched slightly, a sign Hastings recognized as amusement or intrigue. Madam Cavendish, Poirot said, turning to Murray, you defend Monsieur Inglethorpe. Yet I have heard whispers of discord in your marriage. Perhaps this discord extends to your feelings. About your mother-in-law's decisions, Mary's cheeks flushed, but her composure held. I respected Emily's choices, even if I didn't always agree with them. As for my marriage, that's hardly relevant to her death, is it not? Poirot murmured, jotting something in his notebook. In a house such as this, every relationship is a thread in the web. Hastings watched the exchange, his mind racing. Mary's defensiveness intrigued him, especially given her apparent friendship with Dr. Bauerstein. The doctor, with his expertise in toxicology, had been a frequent visitor to Styles, often seen strolling with Mary in the gardens. Could their closeness mask a darker intent? Hastings made a mental note to share his suspicions with Poirot later. The detective turned next to Lawrence, who had remained silent by the window. "Monsieur Lawrence, you are a man of medicine, oui? You have knowledge of poisons, perhaps even." Strychnine. Lawrence's pale face grew paler. "I studied medicine, yes, but I'm no expert in poisons. I've never handled strychnine outside of a classroom. And yet," Poirot said, his voice soft, "you have access to the dispensary, where Mademoiselle Cynthia works, a place where such substances might be obtained." Cynthia, who had been quietly listening, gasped. "Mr. Poirot, you can't think I had anything to do with this. I adored Emily. She was like a mother to me." Poirot raised a placating hand. "Mademoiselle, I accuse no one yet. I merely seek to understand the possibilities. The strychnine, it was likely administered in Madame Inglethorpe's coffee or cocoa. Who prepared these drinks on the night of her death?" The question hung in the air, and Hastings noticed the household exchange uneasy glances. Mary spoke first. "Dorcas, the maid, usually prepared Emily's cocoa, but that night Emily took coffee instead. I believe I poured it for her." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "You poured it, madam, and where was this coffee consumed?" "In the drawing-room," Mary said. "We were all there, John, Lawrence, Cynthia, and I. Alfred was out, and Evelyn had already left." Poirot nodded, scribbling furiously. "And the cup, it was found in Madame Inglethorpe's room, oui. A curious detail. For a locked room." Hastings frowned, recalling the locked bedroom door, which had been forced open when Emily was found convulsing. The coffee cup, with its faint residue, had been a key piece of evidence. Yet its presence in the locked room puzzled him. How had the poison been administered so precisely as the morning wore on? Poirot's questions grew more pointed, weaving a net around the household secrets. He asked Cynthia about her work at the dispensary, probing whether strychnine could have been taken without her knowledge. He pressed Lawrence on his whereabouts the night of the murder, noting the young man's evasiveness, and he returned to John, asking about a heated conversation Hastings had overheard between John and Emily days before her. "Death, it was nothing," John said gruffly. "A disagreement about estate matters. Mother was stubborn, but I didn't wish her harm." Poirot's expression remained unreadable. "And yet, monsieur, your mother's death benefits her husband, not you. A motive, perhaps, for someone to act." The accusation, though veiled, stunned the room into silence. Hastings felt a pang of sympathy for John, whose frustration was palpable, but he couldn't shake the sense that Poirot was onto something. The detective's little grey cells, as he called them, were piecing together a puzzle Hastings couldn't yet see. After the interviews, Poirot and Hastings retreated to the garden, where the summer air was heavy with the scent of roses. Hastings, unable to contain his curiosity, blurted, "Poirot, you're circling Alfred, aren't you? His absence that night, the rumours about Mrs. Rakesett, all points to him." Poirot's eyes twinkled with amusement. "Mon ami, you leap to conclusions like a grasshopper. Alfred Inglethorpe is indeed a figure of interest. But the truth, it is not so simple. Consider Mademoiselle Evelyn's departure, so sudden, so dramatic, and yet her loyalty to Madame Inglethorpe was fierce. Why leave so abruptly?" Hastings frowned. She accused Alfred of infidelity and worse. Maybe she couldn't stand to be under the same roof as him. "Perhaps," Poirot said, plucking a leaf from a nearby bush and examining it, Or perhaps her departure was a performance, designed to shift suspicion. And then there is Dr. Bauerstein, whom you regard with such suspicion, Hastings. Hastings flushed. He's a poison expert, Poirot, and he's too close to Mary. I overheard them talking in the garden yesterday, something about keeping it quiet. It sounded suspicious. Poirot chuckled softly. Your imagination, it is vivid, moan. Share. But suspicion alone is not evidence. We must seek the missing link, the one piece that ties the threads together. The conversation was interrupted by Dorcas, the maid, who approached with a worried expression. Mr. Poirot, sir, I've found something odd in Mrs. Inglethorpe's room. It was tucked behind the mirror, a letter, half burned. Poirot's eyes lit up. A letter, you say? Lead us to it, Vite. Chapter 7. The false beard-clothed morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Styles Court, casting long shadows across the polished oak floors of the drawing-room. Captain Arthur Hastings sat in a high-backed chair, his fingers drumming idly on the armrest as he watched Hercule Poirot pace with that peculiar, deliberate gait of his. The Belgian detective's small, precise steps seemed almost choreographed, as if each movement were part of a grand performance only he understood. His green eyes gleamed with a quiet intensity, and his moustache twitched occasionally, betraying the rapid workings of his mind. Hastings, for his part, was restless. The events of the past few days, the chaos of Emily Inglethorpe's death, the inquest, the whispers of poison had left him uneasy. He had always prided himself on his intuition, but Poirot's methodical approach made him feel like a novice, grasping at shadows while the detective saw the world in sharp, unyielding clarity. The discovery of strychnine as the cause of Emily's death had only deepened the mystery, and Hastings was eager for answers. Yet Poirot, as always, seemed in no hurry to share his thoughts. Poirot, Hastings ventured, breaking the silence. You've been pacing for a good half-hour. Surely you've something to say about this wretched business? Poirot paused mid-step, turning to face his friend with a faint smile. Mon ami, patience is a virtue you have yet to master. The little grey cells, they work best when given time to arrange the facts, to see the pattern where others see only chaos. Hastings sighed, leaning back in his chair. Patterns, Poirot, all I see is a tangle of motives and suspicions. Alfred Inglethorpe stands to gain the most from Emily's death, yet you seem reluctant to point the finger at him. And now there's talk of this Dr. Bauerstein skulking about Mary's friend, no less. It's all a muddle. Poirot's smile widened, though there was a hint of exasperation in it. A muddle, you say? Non, Hastings, it is not a muddle. It is a puzzle, and each piece, no matter how small, has its place. You must learn to observe, not merely to see. Tell me, what did you make of the attic? Hastings frowned, caught off guard. The attic? I haven't been up there since we arrived. Why? What's in the attic? Poirot's eyes twinkled with that infuriating air of knowing something Hastings did not. Come, mon ami, let us take a little promenade. There is something I wish you to see. The two men left the drawing-room, climbing the narrow staircase that led to the upper floors of Styles Court. The air grew mustier as they ascended, the scent of old wood and dust mingling with the faint tang of polish. The attic was a low-ceilinged space, cluttered with forgotten relics of the Cavendish family, trunks stuffed with moth-eaten clothes, a cracked mirror leaning against a wall, and a jumble of furniture that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Sunlight streamed through a single grimy window, illuminating motes of dust that danced in the air. Poirot moved with purpose, his small frame weaving through the clutter until he reached a corner where a pile of old, theatrical costumes lay in disarray. He crouched down, his gloved fingers delicately sifting through the heap until he pulled out a small, curious object, a false beard, its dark hairs matted but unmistakably artificial. Hastings stared, his brow furrowing. What the devil is that? A beard, mon ami, Poirot replied, holding it up to the light. A false one, to be precise, and not, I think, a relic of some long-forgotten masquerade. This is a clue. Hastings, a most important clue. A clue? Hastings echoed, incredulous. It's just a bit of costume nonsense. Probably left over from one of John's old amateur theatricals. Poirot shook his head, his expression grave. "Non, non. You underestimate its significance. This beard, it was used recently. Observe the glue along the edges. It is fresh, not brittle. Someone in this house has worn it, and I suspect for a purpose most sinister." Hastings felt a chill run down his spine. "You mean someone disguised themselves? To what end?" Poirot stood, tucking the beard into a small evidence bag he produced from his pocket. "To purchase strychnine, perhaps. To move unseen, to act without being recognized. The question is, who and why?" The detective's words hung in the air as they descended the stairs, returning to the brighter, more orderly world below. But the discovery of the beard had shifted something in Hastings' mind. The idea of a disguise suggested calculation, a deliberate plan to deceive. His thoughts turned immediately to Alfred Inglethorpe, the man who seemed to hover at the center of every suspicion. Could he have donned a false beard to buy the poison that killed his wife? It seemed plausible, yet Poirot's reluctance to accuse Alfred outright gnawed at him. They returned to the drawing room, where Poirot set the evidence bag on a side table and began to examine it more closely under the light of a lamp. "We must consider the possibilities," he said, almost to himself. "The strychnine was purchased, yes, but by whom? And how did it find its way into Madame Inglethorpe's cocoa or coffee?" "Cocoa or coffee?" Hastings muttered, rubbing his temples. "That's another thing. The inquest couldn't even settle on which it was. Surely that's important?" Poirot nodded, his eyes still fixed on the beard. "It is very important, Hastings. The method of delivery is the key to understanding the mind of the murderer. But for now, let us focus on this beard. It suggests a disguise, and a disguise suggests premeditation. We must learn where this strychnine was obtained." Hastings leaned forward, his curiosity piqued. "You think someone impersonated Alfred to buy it? To frame him, perhaps," Poirot said, his tone non-committal. "Or perhaps it was Alfred himself, wishing to obscure his actions. But we must not jump to conclusions. We must investigate, and for that we must visit the dispensary, where Mademoiselle Cynthia works." The mention of Cynthia Murdoch, the young woman who worked at the local hospital's dispensary, sent a pang of unease through Hastings. She was a lively, charming girl, and he had grown fond of her in the short time he'd been at Styles. The idea that she might be connected to the poison, even tangentially, was troubling. "Cynthia," he said, his voice betraying his concern. "Surely you don't think she's involved?" Poirot raised a hand, forestalling any protest. "I think nothing, Hastings, until the facts are clear. But Mademoiselle Cynthia has access to poisons, does she not? And so does Monsieur Lawrence, who studies medicine. We must consider all possibilities." The drive to the village was a quiet one, the rolling Essex countryside passing in a blur of green fields and hedgerows. Hastings sat beside Poirot in the hired motor car, his mind racing. The dispensary was a small, tidy building attached to the village hospital, its shelves lined with bottles and jars of every description. Cynthia greeted them with her usual warmth, though her smile faltered when she saw the seriousness in Poirot's expression. "Monsieur Poirot." "Captain Hastings," she said, brushing a strand of dark hair from her face. "What brings you here?" "Not more trouble, I hope." Poirot's demeanor softened, but only slightly. "Mademoiselle, I regret that I must ask questions of a delicate nature. You work here in the dispensary, where poisons such as strychnine are kept." Cynthia's eyes widened, but she nodded. "Yes, of course, but it's all strictly controlled. We keep records of everything." "May I see these records?" Poirot asked. His tone polite but firm. Cynthia hesitated, then led them to a ledger behind the counter. She flipped through the pages, her fingers trembling slightly. "Here," she said, pointing to a recent entry. "No strychnine has been dispensed in weeks, and certainly not to anyone from Styles." Poirot's eyes scanned the page, his lips pursed. "And who has access to this dispensary, mademoiselle, besides yourself?" "Well, there's the head pharmacist, Mr. Mace," Cynthia replied. And Dr. Bauerstein comes in sometimes, though he's more of a consultant. Oh, and Lawrence Mr. Cavendish, has been helping with some of the inventory since he's studying medicine. Poirot's mustache twitched and Hastings knew that look. The detective had latched onto something, though what, he couldn't say. Merci, mademoiselle. Poirot said, closing the ledger. You have been most helpful. One more question. Have you ever seen a man with a beard, perhaps an unusual one? Purchasing anything here? Cynthia frowned, thinking. A beard? No. I don't think so. Most of our customers are locals, and I'd noticed something like that. Poirot nodded, satisfied for the moment. As they left the dispensary, Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that they were missing something vital. The false beard, the strychnine, the locked bedroom, it all pointed to a plan far more intricate than he had imagined. Back at Styles Court, the atmosphere was thick with tension. John Cavendish paced the library, his face drawn. Mary, his wife, sat by the window, her expression unreadable. Lawrence, as always, seemed lost in his own thoughts, scribbling in a notebook. The household was fracturing under the weight of suspicion, and Hastings felt it keenly. Poirot, however, was undeterred. He gathered the family in the library that evening, his small frame commanding the room with an authority that belied his stature. Miss Amice, he began, his voice steady, we are dealing with a crime of great cunning. The false beard I have found suggests that someone wished to act in secret, to hide their true face. But I assure you, the truth will not remain hidden for long. John stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. A false beard. What are you saying, Poirot? That someone pretended to be Alfred? Chapter 8. Fresh suspicions ariseth. Morning sun filtered through the heavy curtains of Styles Court, casting long, slanted beams across the oak-panelled dining room. The air was thick with the scent of toast and coffee, but the atmosphere at the breakfast table was far from convivial. Captain Arthur Hastings sat across from Mary Cavendish, her delicate features set in a mask of restraint as she stirred her tea with slow, deliberate movements. John Cavendish, her husband, sat at the head of the table, his eyes fixed on the newspaper. Though Hastings doubted he was reading a single word, the tension in the room was palpable, a silent undercurrent that had only grown stronger since Emily Inglethorpe's death. Hastings sipped his coffee, his mind racing. The events of the past few days had left him unsettled, his thoughts a tangle of suspicion and uncertainty. Hercule Poirot's methodical investigation had begun to peel back the layers of deceit within the household, yet the truth remained elusive like a shadow just beyond reach. The discovery of the fake beard in the attic had only deepened the mystery, suggesting a deliberate attempt to frame Alfred Inglethorpe for his wife's murder. But who had worn it, and why? Hastings' gaze flickered to Mary, whose cool composure seemed at odds with the chaos around them. Could she be hiding something? The door to the dining room swung open, and Lawrence Cavendish entered, his face pale and drawn. He murmured a greeting and took his seat, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his napkin. Hastings noted the strain in his eyes, the same strain he had observed in John. The Cavendish brothers were not themselves, and Hastings couldn't shake the feeling that their unease went beyond grief for their stepmother. "Good morning, Lawrence," Hastings said, attempting to break the silence. "Did you sleep well?" Lawrence's lips twitched in a faint, humorless smile. "As well as one can. Under the circumstances, this house, it feels like it's holding its breath, waiting for something to happen." Mary glanced up sharply, her teaspoon clinking against the saucer. "Waiting for what, Lawrence? For Poirot to point the finger at one of us?" Her tone was light, almost teasing, but there was an edge to it that made Hastings' skin prickle. Lawrence flushed, his eyes dropping to his plate. "I didn't mean that, Mary. It's just everything feels wrong. Mother Emily gone, and all these questions hanging over us." John folded his newspaper with a snap, his jaw tight. "Let's not start this again. Poirot's doing his job, and we'd do well to let him get on with it. Speculation won't bring her back." The sharpness in John's voice silenced the room, but Hastings couldn't help but notice the way Mary's fingers tightened around her cup. There was a history here, a rift between husband and wife that seemed to grow wider with each passing day. Hastings had always admired Mary's poise, her ability to maintain an air of elegance even in the face of tragedy. But now he wondered if the poise concealed something more, something dangerous. As breakfast concluded, the household dispersed, each member retreating to their own corner of the sprawling villa. Hastings lingered in the dining room, his thoughts turning to Dr. Bauerstein, the poison expert who had become a frequent visitor to Styles Court. The man's dark eyes and sharp intellect had left an impression on Hastings, but not a favorable one. There was something about Bauerstein's manner to smooth, to calculate that set Hastings' nerves on edge, and then there was his closeness to Mary. Hastings had seen them together in the garden the previous evening, their heads bent close in conversation, Mary's laughter ringing out in a way it rarely did in John's presence. Could Bauerstein be involved in Emily's death? The thought had taken root in Hastings' mind, growing stronger with each passing hour. As a poison expert, Bauerstein would have the knowledge to administer strychnine in a way that mimicked a natural death, and his presence at Styles Court, so conveniently timed, seemed suspicious. Hastings resolved to share his theory with Poirot, though he dreaded the detective's inevitable dismissal of his ideas. He found Poirot in the library, seated at a small writing desk, his small, precise hands sorting through a stack of papers. The detective's mustache was impeccably groomed, his suit immaculate despite the early hour. He looked up as Hastings entered, his green eyes gleaming with that peculiar intensity that always made Hastings feel as though Poirot could see straight through him. "Mon ami," Poirot said, his voice warm but tinged with amusement. "You have the look of a man with a theory. Come, share it with Poirot. What new suspicions have sprouted in that fertile imagination of yours?" Hastings bristled at the teasing tone, but pressed on. "It's about Dr. Bauerstein. I've been thinking he's an expert in poisons. Isn't he? Strychnine would be child's play for someone like him. And he's been spending a lot of time with Mary Cavendish. I saw them together last night. In the garden, they seemed close." Poirot leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. "Dr. Bauerstein, you say? An interesting choice, Hastings. Tell me, what motive do you propose for this eminent toxicologist? Why would he risk his reputation to poison Madame Inglethorpe?" Hastings hesitated, aware that his theory was built more on instinct than evidence. "Well, perhaps he's involved with Mary. If she and John are having difficulties, maybe Bauerstein saw an opportunity. Emily's death could benefit Mary financially, and Bauerstein might be entangled in her plans." Poirot's lips twitched, but his expression remained unreadable. "Entangled, you say? A charming word, Hastings, but vague. You suggest an affair. Perhaps a conspiracy between Madame Cavendish and the good doctor? It is a romantic notion, but Poirot requires more than romance to build a case. What evidence do you have of this entanglement?" Hastings shifted uncomfortably. "I don't have evidence, exactly. It's just a feeling. The way they were talking last night, it didn't seem innocent." Poirot's eyes narrowed, and for a moment Hastings thought he saw a flicker of interest. But then the detective shook his head, his tone gentle but firm. "Feelings, mon ami, are not facts. Dr. Bauerstein is a man of science, and his presence here is indeed curious. But to leap from curiosity to accusation is a step too far. We must follow the evidence, not the heart." Hastings opened his mouth to protest, but Poirot raised a hand to silence him. "However, your observation of Madame Cavendish and Dr. Bauerstein is not without value. Poirot will consider it. Now, let us turn to more pressing matters. I have been examining the household's movements on the night of the murder, and there is a discrepancy that troubles me." Hastings leaned forward, his earlier frustration forgotten. "A discrepancy? What kind?" Poirot's eyes gleamed. "It concerns the cocoa, Hastings. The cocoa that Madame Inglethorpe drank before her death. The cup was found in her room, yet no one in the household recalls preparing it. Curious, none? And then there is the matter of the locked door. Why was it locked from the inside, yet the key was found in the possession of another?" Hastings frowned, trying to follow Poirot's train of thought. You think the cocoa is the key, that the strychnine was in the cocoa, not the coffee. Poirot nodded slowly. It is possible. The coffee cup was examined, but the cocoa cup, it was overlooked. A mistake, perhaps, by the murderer, or perhaps a deliberate misdirection. Poirot must know more. The detective rose from his chair, his movements brisk and purposeful. Come, Hastings. We must speak with Dorcas, the maid. She is observant, and her memory may hold the clue we seek. They found Dorcas in the kitchen, her hands busy polishing. Silver. The elderly maid looked up as they entered, her expression a mix of curiosity and apprehension. Mr. Poirot, Captain Hastings, she said, setting down her cloth. Is there something I can help you with? Poirot smiled, his charm disarming. Mademoiselle Dorcas, you are the eyes and ears of this house. Tell me, on the night of Madame Inglethorpe's death, do you recall preparing a cup of cocoa for her? Dorcas frowned, her brow furrowing as she thought. Cocoa, sir? No, I don't believe so. I made her coffee that evening as usual. She liked it strong with a bit of cream, but cocoa? No, I don't think so. Poirot's eyes gleamed, and yet a cocoa cup was found in her room, empty, but with traces of the beverage. Who else might have prepared it? Dorcas shook her head, her hands twisting in her apron. I couldn't say, sir. The kitchen was quiet that night. I went to bed early, after serving the coffee. If someone made cocoa, it wasn't me. Poirot nodded, his expression thoughtful. Bessie, Dorcas, you have been most helpful. As they left the kitchen, Hastings couldn't contain his curiosity. What does it mean, Poirot? If Dorcas didn't make the cocoa, who did? Poirot's lips curved in a faint smile. That, mon ami, is the question. Someone in this house prepared the cocoa, and someone placed it in Madame Inglethorpe's room. The cocoa is the missing link. Hastings, find the person who made it, and we find the murderer. The rest of the day passed in a blur of interviews and observations. Poirot moved through the house like a bloodhound, his questions sharp and precise, his eyes missing nothing. He spoke with Cynthia Murdoch, whose nervous demeanour suggested she was hiding something, though she denied any knowledge of the cocoa. He questioned Lawrence again, probing his access to the dispensary where strychnine was kept. But Lawrence's answers were vague, his manner distracted. Chapter 9. The inquest's revelations. The morning of the inquest dawned heavy with anticipation. The air in Styles caught thick with unspoken fears and suspicions. Captain Arthur Hastings stood in the drawing-room, gazing out at the Manigid, lawns of the estate, though his mind was far from the serene greenery. The events of the past few days, Emily Inglethorpe's sudden, violent death, the whispers of poison, and a shadow of betrayal had cast a pall over the once lively household. Today, the inquest would lay bare the facts, or at least those the coroner could unearth, and Hastings felt a knot of dread in his stomach. He glanced at his watch. It was nearly time to depart for the village hall, where the proceedings would take place. Hercule Poirot, ever the picture of composure, adjusted his impeccable tie in the mirror nearby. His small, precise movements betrayed none of the turmoil that gripped the rest of the household. Mon ami, he said, catching Hastings' eye in the reflection, you look as though you expect the guillotine. This inquest, it is but a formality, a step toward the truth. We must observe, listen, and think. I can't help it, Poirot, Hastings replied, running a hand through his hair. The idea of Alfred Inglethorpe being questioned, the possibility of an arrest, it's all so grim. And yet, I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something vital. Poirot's mustache twitched, a sign Hastings had come to recognize as amusement or satisfaction. Missing something, we. But fear not, Hastings, the little grey. Cells are at work. The inquest will reveal much, though perhaps not all we need. Patience. My friend, the household gathered in the hall, a sombre procession. John Cavendish, his face etched with worry, walked beside his wife, Mary, whose cool demeanour seemed a shield against the day's uncertainties. Lawrence Cavendish, pale and withdrawn, kept his eyes on the floor, while Cynthia Murdoch clutched her shawl tightly, her youthful face clouded with anxiety. Alfred Inglethorpe, The man at the center of suspicion maintained an air of detached calm, though his eyes darted nervously when he thought no one was watching. Dorcas, the loyal maid, and other servants trailed behind, whispering among themselves. The village hall was a modest building, its wooden benches filled with curious locals and a handful of reporters scribbling in there. Notebooks. The coroner, a stern man named Mr. Wells, presided with an air of authority, his voice cutting through the murmurs as he called the inquest to order. Hastings settled beside Poirot, who sat ramrod straight, his eyes scanning the room like a hawk. The first witness was Dr. Wilkins, the local physician who had examined Emily Inglethorpe's body. He stepped to the stand, his manner professional but tinged with unease. Mrs. Inglethorpe died of strychnine poisoning, he stated, his voice steady. The symptoms, convulsions, rigidity, and the characteristic arched back are unmistakable. Death likely occurred between midnight and 2 a.m. on July 18th. The coroner leaned forward. Can you confirm the source of the strychnine? Dr. Wilkins hesitated. It was likely administered orally, possibly in her coffee or cocoa, as these were consumed shortly before her symptoms began. The exact quantity is difficult to determine without further tests, but it was sufficient to be fatal within hours. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Hastings glanced at Poirot, who remained impassive, though his fingers tapped lightly on his near sign of intense concentration. The next witness, Dorcas, recounted the events of that fateful night. Her voice trembled as she described Emily's cries, the locked bedroom door, and the chaos that followed. I heard her scream, sir, Dorcas said, wringing her hands. It was awful, like nothing I'd ever heard. We tried to get in, but the door was locked, and Mr. Inglethorpe, he wasn't there. The coroner's eyes narrowed. Mr. Inglethorpe was absent, yes. Sir, Dorcas replied. He'd gone out. Earlier that evening, said he had business in the village. He didn't return until after we'd broken into the mistress's room. Alfred Inglethorpe's absence was a damning detail, and the room buzzed with speculation. Hastings felt a surge of suspicion, but Poirot's calm demeanour tempered his impulse to jump to conclusions. The coroner called Alfred himself to the stand, and the man rose with a measured grace that seemed almost rehearsed. His dark eyes met the coroner's without flinching, though Hastings noted a faint sheen of sweat on his brow. Mr. Inglethorpe, Mr. Wells began. Can you account for your whereabouts on the evening of July 17th? Alfred's voice was smooth, almost too smooth. I was in the village, attending to some personal matters. I returned to Styles Court shortly after midnight, only to find the household in an uproar. And what were these personal matters? The coroner pressed. Alfred hesitated, his lips tightening. They were of a private nature, concerning a small investment I was considering. I prefer not to elaborate, as they are irrelevant. To my wife's tragic death, the coroner's skepticism was palpable, and the crowd whispered anew. Hastings leaned toward Poirot. He's hiding something, he murmured. That alibi is flimsy at best. Poirot's eyes gleamed. Flimsy. But deliberately so, perhaps. We shall see. The pivotal moment came when Mr. Mace, the village pharmacist, took the stand. A weary man with a nervous tic, he clutched his hat as he spoke. On July 16th, a man came to my shop to purchase strychnine. He said it was for poisoning rats at Styles Court. I recognized him as Mr. Inglethorpe. The room erupted in gasps. Hastings. Heart raced, but Poirot's hand shot out, gripping his arm. Wait, mon ami, he whispered urgently. Listen closely. The coroner's voice was sharp. You are certain it was Mr. Inglethorpe? Mr. Mace nodded vigorously. Yes, sir. He signed the poison register himself. I'd know him anywhere. His beard, his manner. It was him. Alfred rose, his face pale, but composed. I deny this entirely, he said, his voice steady. I made no such purchase. This is a mistake, or worse, a fabrication. The coroner dismissed Alfred's protest with a wave, but Poirot's eyes narrowed. He leaned toward Hastings, his voice barely audible. The beard, Hastings. The beard is the key. Why does Mr. Mace emphasize it so, before Hastings could? Respond, the coroner called for the poison register, which was produced and examined. There, in black ink, was Alfred Inglethorpe's signature, dated July 16th. The evidence seemed irrefutable, and the room's atmosphere grew oppressive. Hastings felt a chill. Alfred's arrest seemed imminent, yet Poirot, to Hastings' astonishment, stood abruptly. "Mr. Wells, if I may," he interjected, his voice carrying a quiet authority. "I am Hercule Poirot, a private investigator assisting in this matter. I urge caution before proceeding against Mr. Inglethorpe. Certain discrepancies in the evidence require further examination." The coroner frowned but nodded. "What discrepancies, Mr. Poirot?" Poirot's mustache quivered as he spoke. "The signature in the register is indeed Mr. Inglethorpe's, or appears to be. Yet the circumstances of the purchase are curious. Why would a man intent on murder sign his own name so boldly? And the beard, as Mr. Mace describes it, does it not strike you as too convenient a detail?" The room fell silent, all eyes on Poirot. Hastings, though baffled, felt a surge of admiration for his friend's audacity. The coroner, after a moment's consideration, allowed Poirot to question Mr. Mace. "Mr. Mace," Poirot began, his tone deceptively mild, "you say the man resembled Mr. Inglethorpe. Was it his face, his voice, or perhaps his attire that convinced you?" Mr. Mace blinked, clearly unsettled. "Well, it was his beard, mostly, and his height, his build. I'm sure it was him." "And did he speak at length?" Poirot pressed. "Did you note his voice?" Mr. Mace faltered. "Not much, sir. He was in a hurry, said what he needed and left." Poirot nodded as if satisfied, though his eyes betrayed a deeper calculation. "Thank you, Mr. Mace. That will be all for now." As the pharmacist stepped down, Poirot returned to his seat, ignoring the curious stares. Hastings whispered, "What was that about? You can't seriously think Alfred is innocent?" Poirot's smile was enigmatic. "Innocent? Perhaps not, but framed? That, mon ami, is a possibility we cannot ignore. The signature, the beard, they are too perfect to deliberate. Someone wishes us to believe Mr. Inglethorpe guilty, and I, Hercule Poirot, do not like to be led by the nose." The inquest continued, with testimony from other household members. Mary Cavendish spoke briefly, confirming she had seen Emily drink cocoa before retiring. John admitted to the strained relations with his stepmother over her marriage, but denied any involvement in her death. Lawrence, when questioned, seemed distracted, his answers vague, which only deepened Hastings' suspicions of him. Then came a surprising revelation. The coroner presented a fragment of paper recovered from the fireplace in Emily's room. It was charred but legible in parts, bearing the words "My last will and to my husband." The room buzzed again. This suggested Emily had been altering her will, perhaps to favor Alfred or to exclude him entirely. The implications were staggering. Had someone killed her to prevent a change in her fortune? Hastings' mind raced. "Poirot, this changes everything. If Emily was rewriting her will, it gives Alfred a motive, or someone else who feared losing their inheritance." Poirot's eyes twinkled. "Oui, it changes much, but it also clarifies the will. The strychnine, the locked door, these are pieces of a puzzle, and we are close to seeing its shape. But we must tread carefully, Hastings. The truth is a delicate thing." Chapter 10. Poirot's debt to Emmeline morning sun filtered through the heavy drapes of Styles Court, casting long shadows across the polished wood floors of the drawing-room. Hercule Poirot stood by the fireplace, his small, neat figure framed against the ornate mantelpiece, his hands clasped behind his back. His eyes, sharp and green as a cat's, surveyed the room with a quiet intensity, as though the very walls might whisper secrets to him. Captain Arthur Hastings, seated in a high-backed chair near the window, watched his friend with a mixture of admiration and impatience. The events of the past days, the inquest, the mounting evidence against Alfred Inglethorpe, the cryptic clues Poirot seemed to hoard like precious gems, had left Hastings restless, his mind a whirl of half-formed theories and unanswered questions. The household was in disarray. Emily Inglethorpe's death had fractured the fragile harmony of Styles Court, and suspicion hung over its inhabitants like a fog. Alfred, Emily's much younger husband, stood at the center of the storm, his weak alibi and financial motives painting him as the prime suspect in her poisoning. Yet Poirot, with his maddening calm, had prevented Alfred's arrest at the inquest, insisting there was more to uncover. Hastings could not fathom why. To him, the case seemed clear. Alfred had the means, the motive, and the opportunity. But Poirot's mind, those little grey cells he so often praised, worked in ways Hastings could scarcely follow. Poirot turned from the fireplace, his moustache twitching slightly as he fixed his gaze on Hastings. "Mon ami," he said, his voice low and deliberate, "you are troubled, are you not? You think, perhaps, that Poirot hesitates too long, that he plays the game of cat and mouse when the truth is plain." Hastings shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Well, Poirot, I'll admit it does seem rather straightforward. Alfred's alibi is flimsy at best. The pharmacist swears he sold strychnine to someone who looked like him, and that burned will. Fragment why, it practically screams guilt. You've seen the way he skulks about, avoiding questions, and yet you hold back. What are you waiting for?" Poirot's eyes gleamed with a faint amusement, though his expression remained serious. "The truth, Hastings, is not a loud voice that shouts its presence. It is a whisper easily missed by those who rush to judgment. You see Alfred Inglethorpe, and you see a man who appears guilty. But appearances, mon ami, are the devil's favourite mask." Hastings frowned, leaning forward. "But the evidence, evidence," Poirot interrupted, raising a finger. "Evidence is a tool, not a master. It can be shaped, manipulated, planted. You think Alfred is the villain because the clues point to him. But what if, Hastings, the clues were meant to point to him? What if the true villain wishes us to see only what they have arranged?" Hastings blinked, his mind grappling with the idea. "You mean someone's framing him? But who and why go to such lengths?" Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he crossed the room with his precise, measured steps and picked up a small porcelain figurine from a side table, turning it over in his hands as though it held the answer to all mysteries. "There is a clue," he said at last, "a clue I have found that changes everything. It is not a thing of great size or weight, but its significance is immense. It tells me that we are not dealing with a simple crime of greed, but with a conspiracy, a plan most cunning and most cruel." Hastings' heart quickened. "A clue. What is it? You've been so dashed secretive, Poirot. Can't you tell me?" Poirot's lips curved into a faint smile. "Patience, my friend. The clue is a letter hidden in Emily Inglethorpe's room. I found it this morning, concealed in a secret compartment of her writing desk. It is a letter that speaks of betrayal, of plans made in the shadows. But it is not yet time to reveal its contents. First, I must confirm one final detail. A letter?" Hastings echoed, his curiosity piqued. "From whom to whom? Come on, Poirot. You can't leave me hanging like this." Poirot set the figurine down and turned to face Hastings. "Fully. The letter is from Emily Inglethorpe herself," he said softly, "and it is addressed to someone she trusted deeply, someone who has played a part in this drama from the beginning. But I will say no more until I am certain. To act too soon is to risk the escape of the true culprit." Hastings opened his mouth to protest, but the sound of footsteps in the hall silenced him. The door swung open, and Mary Cavendish entered, her face pale and drawn. Her dark eyes darted between Poirot and Hastings, and there was a tension in her posture that suggested she had not slept well. "Monsieur Poirot," she said, her voice strained, "I heard you were here. Have you found anything new about Emily's death, I mean?" Poirot inclined his head, his expression unreadable. "Madame Cavendish, I have found many things, but the puzzle is not yet complete. Tell me, if you please, where were you yesterday evening? Between the hours of 8 and 10, Mary's eyes widened slightly, and she clasped her hands together. "I was in my room, reading." "Why do you ask? And your husband, Monsieur John, was he with you?" Mary hesitated, her gaze flickering to the floor. "No, John was out. He said he had business in the village." Poirot nodded as though this confirmed something he already suspected. And you saw no one else, heard nothing unusual? Mary shook her head, but her fingers tightened around each other, betraying her unease. No, nothing. It was a quiet evening. Monsieur Poirot, please, if you know something, you must tell us. This uncertainty is unbearable. Poirot's eyes softened, but only for a moment. Madam, I understand your distress, but rest assured, Poirot does not rest until justice is served. You have my word. Mary nodded, though she looked far from, reassured, and excused herself, leaving the room as quietly as she had entered. Hastings watched her go, his mind racing. She's hiding something, Poirot, he said as soon as the door closed. Did you see how nervous she was? And John being out last night, doesn't that strike you as suspicious? Poirot raised an eyebrow. Everything, Hastings, strikes me as suspicious until it is proven otherwise. But Madame Cavendish's nerves are not necessarily a sign of guilt. They may be the sign of a woman caught in a web she does not fully understand. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of John Cavendish, his face flushed with agitation. Poirot, I've just heard from the village. They're saying Alfred's going to be arrested today. Is it true? Did you stop it at the inquest only to let it happen now? Poirot held up a hand, his voice calm but firm. Monsieur Cavendish, no arrest will take place until I am satisfied. The police, they are eager, but they lack the precision of Poirot. I have asked for a delay, and they have agreed for now. John ran a hand through his hair, his frustration evident. But why? The evidence is overwhelming. The strychnine, the will, his absence at night, it all points to Alfred. What more do you need? Poirot's eyes narrowed. I need the truth, monsieur, and the truth is not always found in the loudest clues. Tell me, why are you so certain of your stepfather's guilt? Is it because of the evidence, or because you wish it to be so? John's face reddened further, and he took a step toward Poirot, his voice rising. That's unfair. Poirot, Alfred married my mother for her money. Everyone knows it. He's been nothing but trouble since he arrived, and now she's dead, and he stands to inherit everything. You can't seriously think he's innocent. Poirot remained unruffled, his gaze steady. I think, monsieur, that innocence and guilt are not determined by anger or assumption. They are determined by facts, and the facts, they tell me that there is more to this case than meets the eye. John stared at Poirot for a long moment, then turned and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Hastings shook his head. He's got a temper, that one. Do you think he's involved, Poirot? Poirot did not answer immediately. Instead, he moved to the window and looked out at the gardens where the roses were in full bloom, their beauty a stark contrast to the darkness within the house. John Cavendish, he said at last, is a man of passion but not of cunning. His anger is genuine, but it blinds him. No, Hastings, the true culprit is one who plans, who calculates, who leaves nothing to chance. Hastings leaned back in his chair, his mind a whirl of possibilities. The letter Poirot had mentioned intrigued him, but his friend's refusal to share its contents was maddening. He tried to piece together the puzzle himself, the strychnine, the fake beard found in the attic, the burned will fragment, Alfred's weak alibi, Evelyn Howard's sudden departure, and now this letter, hidden by Emily herself. What did it mean? Was it a plea for help, a warning, or something else entirely? The letter, Poirot murmured, almost to himself, was not meant to be found by just anyone. It was hidden with care, as though Madame Inglethorpe knew her life was in danger. And yet, she did not act to save herself. Why, Hastings? Why? Did she not flee or call for help? Hastings frowned, considering the question. Perhaps she didn't realize the danger until it was too late. Or perhaps she trusted the wrong person. Poirot nodded, his eyes gleaming. Pray,